Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from, whether you're with us live or watching this later. Welcome to the 9th Oxford University Press History Book Club meeting and the first one of the new year. My name is Susan Ferber, and I'm one of the history editors at OUP. On behalf of my colleagues, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. For those of you who have been at the previous book club meetings featuring books ranging from Norse America to the American War in Afghanistan to Mahjong and Charlie Brown, welcome back. If you didn't get to see these live, you can find the recordings for all previous events on OUP's YouTube channel. For those of you who are here for the first time, here's a little background. Reading and talking about books in a group has a long tradition. In the 18th and 19th century, the first secular American reading groups or conversations, a precursor to book clubs, were begun. They required little more than a thirst for knowledge and a desire to discuss it with like-minded individuals, to talk about challenging ideas, to learn together, and hopefully to have some fun along the way. That's the spirit in which this book club was founded. What we lack in the intimacy of a small group, I hope we can gain in creating a broad community of readers. This book club will give you the chance to directly interact with authors, as well as an opportunity to continue the conversation online with others in the club. Every meeting features 2 OUP authors in conversation, in this case the writer of a new book with one of our backlist titles. Over time, we aim to share histories from across the globe, from a variety of periods of history, and from many different authorial perspectives. I suspect many of you watching are familiar with the books and movies that present the soldiers of the U.S. military learning to live and fight together, regardless of race, religion, and creed, to save the world from Nazism and totalitarianism in what has been dubbed the Good War. This book tells a very different story. It is my pleasure to introduce our book and authors today. Thomas Guglielmo is Associate Professor and Chair in the Department of American Studies at George Washington University, and the author of White on Arrival, Italians, Race, Color, Power in Chicago, 1890 to 1940. And the book we are discussing today, Divisions, A New History of Racism and Resistance in America's World War II Military. He is joined in conversation by Adriane Lentz-Smith, Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Duke University. She is the author of Freedom Struggles, African Americans in World War I, and most recently for OUP, a groundbreaking chapter entitled The Unbearable Whiteness of Grand Strategy in the volume Rethinking American Grand Strategy. Tom and Adriane are going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then the floor will be open for all of your questions. You can start putting them in the chat anytime, and my colleague Erin Cox will bring up as many as she can after the initial conversation. You can also go to the OUP History Twitter feed and comment using the hashtag OUP History Book Club. Welcome, Tom and Adriane. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Adriane.
I'm going to start out with a question, and actually, I'm going to start where Susan started us. You know, we have a narrative that's pretty common and pretty prevalent of World War II as the good war, right? And I know when Studs Terkel called his book thus in his book of oral histories, it was a much richer, sort of more complex sense of that, right? Slightly ironic. But there's still this sense that like World War II was uncomplicated in a way that later wars weren't. And we see that, you know, we see it in popular culture, we see it in a lot of places. I'm wondering how your book complicates that narrative, how your book speaks to that narrative, kind of what's going on with divisions.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and that's where the book begins. And I think in a lot of ways that's where the book began for me. So when I got my PhD at the University of Michigan in 2000, but I started at the University of California, Santa Barbara in the mid 90s. And I guess it wasn't my first research paper, but my second research paper was about pop culture in World War II, and about this kind of pleasantly plural platoon trope, right? That this, you know, so I read a bunch of popular novels from the war years. I watched a bunch of popular movies and tried to make sense of this this happy mix of soldiers from every region, every race, every ethnicity, and their ability to just kind of transcend these differences, all in the interests of the good war. And so, yeah, that's always been an interest of mine. Though I wasn't one of these kids who kind of grew up watching World War II films or anything. But nonetheless, that was absolutely something that, is so pervasive that I was always very much aware of it. And the book is an attempt to complicate that in a fundamental way, right? So rather than focus on the ways in which the military was this kind of cauldron of, as you said, I think in your email to me, this cauldron of civic nationalism, where it kind of erased so many of these social divisions that were so popular on the home front and so important in civilian life. I tried to understand the ways in which the military did some of that at times, but also was this powerful engine of racist division, and hierarchy and subordination. So that's the way, that in a nutshell is the way in which my book attempts to kind of complicate this story of happy unity,
Yeah, one
happy uncomplicated unity.
one of the things that strikes me in your book is that there's I mean, so much happening at one time, which is kind of a silly thing to say about war. Yes, there's a lot happening at one time, but even like both in terms of what's happening in the historical moment, what you're trying to keep your hands on and sort of your brain
Mhm.
on analytically, um,
Yeah.
and then the ways that um, you're telling a top-down story and a bottom-up story simultaneously. So
Hmm.
when people ask you, what is this book about? Like, and it's kind of, I gotta keep them. They're not historians, and so I just want to tell them, so that they understand me. Like, what do you say?
Yeah, I mean, it took me a long time to write this book, and so I had a lot of practice at kind of coming up with an elevator pitch, and I'm not sure I ever quite landed on anything that's great. But I mean, essentially, what I say is it's mainly two big stories. The first story is about, and both of them are about the military as this kind of forgotten site of really, really important stuff. So two really important things in particular. So one is this kind of top-down story that you mentioned about racism, and the way in which you can't really understand the nature, the persistence, the tenacity, the impact of racism in this period without taking the US military really, really seriously. So that's story number one. And then story number two, and these two stories are linked constantly. Um, but the second story is about civil rights activism, or I should say, kind of civil rights activisms, because there are lots of different movements in this book in opposition to a variety of different racist divisions. But similarly, you can't understand the story of freedom struggles in the 20th century without taking seriously the military, and without taking seriously, in particular, GIs, service members, and their participation in various freedom struggles to make America a more egalitarian place.
So why World War II? Like, did you start? I mean, you said you'd started your sort of graduate school paper writing with World War II, but were you interested in the war itself, in the 40s as a moment? Like, does the war? I mean, I guess what questions came first is sort of a way to ask that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think for me, I was really, it came out of my first book. So my first book was about Italian immigrants in Chicago, very different book, about immigrants coming to the U.S. and how they kind of came to make sense of and slot themselves into, or be slotted into, American racist dynamics, and what difference it all made. But that book ends in World War II, and in writing that book, I spent a bunch of time at the National Archives one summer, and just came across a wealth of incredible source material for anyone interested in social history, for anyone interested in the daily lives of ordinary people. it's so true that the archive so often silences those folks. But for World War II, that was not the case. The state, the US government was so interested in the lives of ordinary people, because it mattered in terms of winning the war, that there was just massive amounts of material. And there was massive amounts of material on issues of race and racism. And so I think it was at that moment when I realized, wow, this could be such an exciting project to tell a larger story about race in World War II. So part of it comes from that, this kind of discovery of such rich material. But it also came from an understanding that World War II does kind of hold this um, um, hold the attention of so many 20th century scholars, right? It is this kind of critical moment when so many things either change or don't change. And so to tell the story of 20th century US history, to tell the story of modern US history, you absolutely have to understand World War II. And so I really thought that um, attempting to kind of tell a new story about race in the war could really be interesting to a lot of people.
So I have many thoughts going in many directions, and I'm going to try to corral them. The first is um, when you were talking about the archives and finding ordinary people and this idea that they silence them, but there are ways in which, perversely, a state that is interested in surveilling its citizens is actually a
Mm-hmm.
really um, useful place for historians to go and do work. So I remember this. I wrote a book on African Americans and World War One, and when I was just trying to figure out, like, what did people think, what was going on, the historian Patricia Sullivan directed me to Bureau of Investigation files and military intelligence files, and all of the places where folks were reporting on their neighbors expressing doubt or skepticism about the viability of fighting for a country that was, denying them civil rights, right? So it
Mm-hmm.
turns out there's all kinds of voices in those archives. It's just that the archives weren't designed for the purposes that I intended to use them. If
Yeah.
that makes sense. And I kind of love that. I mean, it is perverse, right? Because I'm like, oh, thank goodness for Hoover. But
Yeah, I mean, it's so true, right? I mean, so there's a lot of material, but the material um, is you have to be really careful in how you read the material, right? Because it was created for a particular purpose. I'll give you a couple of very quick examples. So one example is, I mentioned that a big part of this book is about freedom struggles, but if you go into the source material, there's very little discussion about freedom struggles or civil rights or activism. So much of what I come to understand as activism was understood during the war in these official documents as Black pathology or Japanese American disloyalty or, you know, right. So much. So yes, a wealth of material, but it requires a really careful understanding of kind of the purposes of some of these documents and how I could kind of work with them against the grain.
um, so who is this book about? That's a very open-ended part of what I'm, because you
Yeah.
mentioned, you said black sort of disloyalty or Japanese disloyalty. Like, who are the groups who are struggling or being surveilled or incorporated or what have you?
So yeah, I mean, so the top-down story is really about or the kind of there are these kind of, again, competing intertwined narratives about kind of racism and anti-racism, to kind of put it super schematically. The racism story is really about white people, essentially, mostly people in positions of power, anywhere from being an officer in the military to a leader of, say, the War Department or the Navy Department, or some leader in the government, like Roosevelt, for example. And that story also involves kind of ordinary service members on the ground as well, because they're playing a role at times. And then the kind of anti-racism story, the kind of story about freedom struggles, involves primarily African Americans, but I talk about Japanese Americans, I talk about Native Americans, I talk about Latinos and Latinas. So it's a big kaleidoscopic mix, and that's one of the things that I think is that's what one of the things I'm proud of is I'm hoping I'm able to kind of tell a bunch of stories together that haven't been quite put together before.
Right. And it's
And
important. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think this is when I'm saying that when I said that there's so much happening in this book, this is part of what I'm thinking about. It's really important to put these stories together, and it's really hard to put these stories together. And I am so very impressed with how you do that. We talk sometimes about how race is constructed, right? That it is not a biological fact, but it is somehow a social or political fact.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you'll break down for us a little bit how you kind of talk about that in the book and the way that you talk about it, not just as constructed, but as relationally constructed, because I think that's
Mhm.
really essential um, to historical understanding, right? To getting and contemporary understanding, but sort of getting what's going on or what has gone on in the world.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for that. I mean, yeah. So race making happens everywhere, and then that's part of what's so unwieldy about the story, right? It's happening everywhere. So it's happening in the form of War Department or Navy Department or U.S. government policy. It's happening in terms of the interactions of ordinary people on the ground. It's happening in terms of who is an officer and who's not. It happens in terms of what sorts of jobs people have, what sorts of pay people receive. It happens in terms of where people go on recreation, both in the United States and when they're overseas, what bar they get to drink in, what dance club they get to go to. Right. So race is being made through what I'm calling divisions, right? Through these kind of everyday and not so everyday efforts to draw distinctions between human beings. And again, those distinctions can happen in all these various places. They can happen in the form of a joke or a story or a myth. It can happen in the form of structures of employment. It can happen in terms of policies with regard to who gets to join certain branches of the military. So it's happening on so many different scales all at once, involving lots and lots of different groups. But that was something that's something as a scholar I've always very much been interested in, this kind of the ways in which human beings are constantly constructing categories and divisions and dividing human beings into these various categories, and the difference, ultimately the real world difference that stuff makes. As you said, it's a social construct, but it's also a political fact. Um, and so anyway, so that's a big part of what this book is about, is just really making it it's easy to kind of say race is a social construction, but to really kind of dig into what ultimately that really means in people's ordinary lives and how it shapes those ordinary lives in such consequential ways. That's a big part of the book.
And are there some generalization? I mean, I'm like, sum up the whole book for me in 10 minutes, but like some big generalizations about what color lines, like what were the most salient color lines or that you saw kind of being made or being maintained in this period? Um,
Right.
and how do you, and this is kind of just a sort of question as an author and a thinker, and how do you write about things so that we understand a little bit more about the constructed nature of now without asserting that those color lines are identical contemporarily? Does that question make sense? It might not even make sense as a question. It's
No,
like a
I think it
half-formed thing in my head.
right. So in terms of the kind of being a little more concrete in terms of what these divisions looked like, in terms of who were they dividing, how they were kind of slicing and dicing humanity essentially. So the most, by far the most important institutionalized, long-standing, consequential racist division in the military divided colored from white, and so in today's terms, black from white. Um, and and black meant people, anyone of kind of quote Negro ancestry, and white was a moving target, as I say in the book. Sometimes it was super inclusive, involving basically anyone who was not black was defined as white. So in those cases, this what appears to be a black-white line is really a black non-black line, because it's black folks on over here and everybody else over here. So anyway, that kind of black-white line was, again, by far the most pervasive. It shifted a little bit during the war because of extensive, incredibly creative, inspiring activism on the part of lots of black troops and allies on the home front, and some white troops as well. But for the most part, it held firm throughout the war. But that wasn't the only, that was, as I said, that kind of white category was a moving target, and that explains another really important division, and that is between white and non-white. So within that category of kind of non-blacks, there were really salient distinctions drawn there too. They weren't as widespread, they tended not to be as institutionalized, they weren't quite as consequential, but nonetheless they really mattered in terms of the day-to-day lives of Mexican American troops and Native American troops, certainly Japanese American troops, Chinese American troops, Filipino American troops, and so forth. So sometimes those folks, this kind of very diverse group of troops, were treated kind of like white people. Sometimes they served with white troops and were again accepted more or less as whites. And so there are ways in which that boundary between non-black people of color and white people kind of erased at times during the war, dissolved a bit, became a little less salient. But nonetheless, that divide between non-black people of color and white people was nonetheless salient throughout the war in all kinds of different ways, in terms of, again, like what kinds of jobs people got, where people served, whether they were on the front lines or not, whether they were in a so-called white unit or not. So lots and lots of different ways that, again, deeply, deeply shaped their lives during the war. So those are the two that kind of black-white divide, and then that white non-white divide. Those are the kind of two most important ones that I talk about kind of wending their way throughout military life during the war. But there's one other one, just to kind of complicate stuff even further. Japanese Americans end up being a really important group in this story, because the kinds of racism they face is distinct from the kinds of racism that, say, African Americans face, because of their perceived connections to America's archenemy in the Pacific, Japan. And so there are moments, especially when issues involve things like national security, there are moments when Japanese Americans are facing a kind of a singular form of racist restriction. So a singularly expansive level of surveillance, for example, that doesn't affect any other troops. And so in those kinds of instances, it's a kind of a Japanese American troops here and everybody else over there. So in that case, it's kind of a Japanese, non-Japanese line. Talking about all these lines all together, I realized your head can begin to spin a bit, the eyes kind of glaze over. It seems very technical, but it was my effort to just kind of make sense of some of this immense complexity.
Yeah, and what's kind of wild about it, right, is that you see, like, there's a way in which you can be like, oh, color lines were made during this period, and that's a certain kind of story. But then you're like, but as you said, it depends on like geography, it depends on purpose. Like the same people can do sort of contrasting or contradictory work depending on like the context in which they're like responding, or in which a need arises or a fear is deployed or what have you. So it's this wild thing where you have to look at things. I mean, and maybe this is like a very elementary observation about cultural work in general, but where you have to look at things as being sort of systematic and deliberate and wildly contingent and not systematic at the same time,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah. So there are these kinds of multiple um, divisions constantly in motion, constantly changing as a consequence of so many different things. Some of the things you've mentioned, and just kind of trying to get a handle on all of that is complex, but fun as well.
So when people, I mean, I don't know if you like, if you, when you're talking to your students, or if you're teaching this in sort of racial formations and your students, like when you're talking to people who aren't practiced in thinking about this as deeply as you are, and you get to the point where they're like, well, okay, so all of that happens, but then we have racism and that's bad, so what? Right? Like, how do you help them think about the utility of thinking about this?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think racism is really, really bad, and therefore it requires all of us to do kind of a lot of work to try to uproot it. But if you're going to uproot it, you're going to need to understand its deep complexities, or else you're not going to uproot it. And so I guess that's kind of my answer is um, you know even at just a very basic level, there are lots of different kinds of racism, shaping, targeting different kinds of groups in different kinds of ways. And sometimes those racisms are kind of in conversation and are shaping one another. So you mentioned the point about kind of relational analyses, right? And that's something I try to really highlight in the book. Is I'm not just telling kind of a comparative story where it's kind of like there are these folks over here and these folks over here, and they're kind of isolated in some kind of sense, right? I'm trying to understand how it is that, say, anti-Black racism shapes the experiences of Japanese Americans and shapes the racism that Japanese American troops faced. And so, for example, in one of the later chapters, I talk about the rise of this model minority idea that's very much uh, uh, um, a product of anti-Black racism. And that's something that Asian American scholars have been saying for a long time. So I'm very much drawing on, building on, reliant on their work and their amazing insights. But I show how that dynamic operates in the war, so that at precisely the time that Japanese Americans are being celebrated as these um, quintessentially heroic American soldiers, the 442nd is receiving all kinds of awards and being exalted on the home front as the kind of the unit that's received the most medals, more medals than any other unit in American military history. And that's something that you still hear. That story is partly a product of Japanese American heroism, no doubt. But it's also partly a product of the military's efforts to kind of leverage Japanese Americans against African Americans, to elevate Japanese Americans at the very same time that they're kind of subordinating African Americans. Those stories, actually, you can't understand one without the other, at least in the context of, say, the battlefronts in Italy in 1945. Those two stories are very much connected. So that's just one example of how kind of a relational analysis really helps us to kind of understand some new things.
Yeah. And it reminds me, when I was writing about World War One, I was always struck by the phrasing when Black Americans, or at that point Negroes, right? And that's relevant to what I'm about to say. When Black folks were asserting their citizenship in the context of kind of wartime xenophobia. And one of the phrases that
Right.
came up often was the Negro's loyalty knows no hyphen. And I remember reading that,
Right.
I think as a college student, even the first time, and thinking, dude, you should watch out, because you like gin up that kind of
Mm,
nastiness, and it's gonna come back. It's gonna redound on you. But for
mm,
them to contrast the what they were asserting as a kind of native loyalty of Black Americans to everybody else, to more recent immigrant groups or what have you, they thought was an effective strategy for asserting you know, Black civil worthiness.
right. Yeah, I mean, so there are lots of examples in the book of where that kind of that just that neat distinction I drew between racism and anti-racism breaks down, and where kind of where struggles are anti-racist in one sense, but are still drawing on racism and therefore racist in another sense. So none of this is super neat, but it is what it is.
Yeah. So the book, I mean, you sort of break the book down. There's a kind of like enlistment and mobilization part. Um, there's training and there's service overseas.
Hmm.
In those, were there places where particular stories jumped out to you, either like helped you into thinking about your analysis, or what you thought were particularly illustrative? Is that how you pronounce that? Of what you were trying to do. I always come back to people telling stories about Black soldiers having tails, which um,
Right.
I just still can't wrap my head around but that's not a sort of full drawn out, that's just an example. But I wondered for you.
Yeah, that from that later chapter, or because that's also something that I think happened a bit in World War One. Do you remember coming across any
So
of
I
those
don't
stories?
remember it coming across it in World War One. I've seen other people talk about it in World War One.
Yeah,
I didn't see it myself.
yeah.
So the first time I ever saw it, I think, was in an article, maybe, or you wrote, or a talk that you gave, even
Mm,
before the book. But I remember just being like, pause, what? And then who?
yeah.
Like, even if you haven't seen Black people, you've seen enough people without tail. Like, just what? I feel like, you ever watch Amber Ruffin on the Seth Meyers show being like, this is crazy. Like, that's how I feel about this. Adrian says, what?
And this is just to kind of explain, right? So this is something that I saw over and over and over again. Well, Black soldiers were reporting seeing over and over and over again overseas. A little bit in the U.S. I think I found a couple of instances in Hawaii, but mainly overseas. But everywhere overseas, in the U.K., in throughout continental Europe, India, China, Australia, the Caribbean. Well, no, not the Caribbean, but anywhere, virtually anywhere U.S. troops were deployed, Black service members came across locals who essentially thought they had tails, thought that they were more monkey than man and had tails. And they asked about it sometimes innocently, like, this is what white officers or white soldiers, American white soldiers and officers told us. And we were just kind of curious. Sometimes it's happening while Black soldiers over someone's house at dinner. So that's fascinating, right? So despite this attempted kind of uh, uh, um, you know dehumanization on the part of white American soldiers, locals are still nonetheless opening their arms in certain cases to African American soldiers. And so it comes up when someone offers them a pillow at dinner, and they say, oh, well, we thought you'd be more comfortable because we heard you had tails or something. So, yeah, that is just 2 or 3
Yeah.
pages in the book, but it is something that I always thought was worthy of its own kind of treatment. But I haven't done that quite yet. But
I think it's
um,
exactly the pillow that stuck with me, because I think if it were me, half of me would be like so outraged and offended, and then some part of me would be like, I mean, I do like sitting on a pillow. But
does look comfortable.
it's like, do I do educational work right now, or do I just make myself comfortable? That's always the dilemma.
Right, right. um, but the original question was kind of, how did I have it kind of organized? Enlistment, um, assignment. Yeah, I just you know, for years, I thought, well, it would be really exciting if I could kind of organize it around a few individual stories, and try to bring this kind of complex, um, technical history of racisms alive through the perspective of kind of a few ordinary people. But I could never quite figure that out, how to do that. I could never find the right people that could tell all the stories I wanted to
Right.
tell. And so I ultimately landed on kind of following service members through their military experience. So starting with the very process of entering the military, moving on to the process by which people are assigned to certain units, and the ways in which segregation happened there or did not happen. There's a kind of middle section on, if you're going to have segregated units, you're going to have to have some kind of authority deciding who goes where, and therefore you're going to have to have some kind of system in place to decide, how to classify people on the basis of race if you're going to have units that are based on race. And so there's that story, and then I follow service members as they train around the United States and then move overseas for service. And
Yeah.
then finally, after they, as they come home and demobilize.
Yeah, I think it's actually really a useful thing to have, because part of it is just kind of like, what does mass mobilization look like in this period? How does it work? How do you like organize all of these people? Like there's a certain kind of um like I hadn't thought about how little I'd thought about the mechanics of it all until I read this book. And then also how that kind of day-to-day mobilization work builds the contemporary, like builds the state, right? Not just sort of like um, for mobilization during there, but sort of puts in place all of these things and practices that can continue to do work. Um, as a maybe a final or one of our final questions, I want to shift gears a little bit. You'd mentioned that you know, had drawn on the work of scholars of Asian American history a little bit to think about this, and I imagine other scholars. I'm curious, just really quickly, like, what were you reading when you wrote this book? Like, what were some of the books that were important to you? And then, and maybe not even just nonfiction, but fiction as well. I love to hear what people are reading.
Yeah, I love that question too. The truth is, it took me so long to write this book. I was reading lots of different things, so, but just a few quick things. So, at a most general level, I think I had in my mind this kind of debate between Tom Brokaw and Tim O'Brien and the things they carried, where, Brokaw says, and this is something that I teach a class on World War II history and memory, and I show this slide with these kind of competing ideas about war stories. And for Brokaw, it's all about heroism and greatness. He's got this, the greatest generation. In the beginning of that book, he says, to tell the story of Americans in this period is to tell the story of the greatest generation that any society has ever produced. That, I think, is more or less a quote, right? So you have that on the one hand, and then you have Tim O'Brien, who says, beware of war stories that inspire you, that talk about greatness, that talk about war elevating people, making them better. If you buy into that, you're buying into a lie. Wars always degrade. They always humiliate. They always, destroy. And and so somehow that kind of debate was helpful for me. But other, in the introduction, I cite Ralph Ellison and W.E.B. Du Bois. So Ellison has this great line about wars within wars. So that was a concept, that I'd read before actually reading it in Ellison, but nonetheless, that was very helpful. Du Bois's point about color lines within color lines. So wars within wars for Ellison, color lines within color lines for Du Bois, meaning there isn't just a single racist division. There are multiple intersecting divisions. And there's a whole scholarship on that. You referred to it, the kind of relational analyses in critical race studies that have been super helpful to me. But Du Bois kind of captured it so succinctly in that great line. There's a bunch of other stuff, but maybe I'll stop
Yeah.
there.
Your answer also makes me think about how much the shadow of the Vietnam War sort of hangs over
Mm-hmm.
much of our scholarship on most wars, right? So that
Mm-hmm.
there's a way that Brokaw Tim O'Brien fight is being played out in a
Mm-hmm.
variety of sites, in a variety of ways.
Yeah, right down on the National Mall where the World War II Memorial is just a couple hundred yards from the Vietnam
Yeah,
Memorial, and they are so diametrically opposed to each other in so many ways.
yeah.
Hello, I'll introduce myself to the audience. I'm Erin Cox, who I'm Susan's colleague here at Oxford University Press, and now is our opportunity to sort of jump in and ask a few questions from the audience. I hate to interrupt such a great conversation between the two of you, but we had a couple of questions that we wanted to ask. So I'll start with this first one. Tom, was there a racial or ethnic group that you really struggled to find information on, or were surprised that was archival material about?
That's a great question. Yeah, I would say the one group that kind of doesn't get enough attention here is I would say people of Middle Eastern descent. They kind of there's so much great scholarship on kind of the complexity of their racial classification and their location in America's kind of racial structure. Um, and I have students who've done fantastic work on this question, and they've always kind of pushed and prodded me to kind of find those stories. And I unfortunately I just couldn't. I think in many cases they were assigned to white units, they were defined as white. The military just didn't have much to say about them. I found much more material about folks who were assigned to white units, but were nonetheless defined as non-white by the military. And so for that reason, the military was much more primed, I think, to kind of understand their experiences, to record their experiences, and I therefore had more accessibility to their stories.
Yeah.
That's a great question.
That's a good question.
When you were thinking about how did thinking about the role of the officers and the top brass alongside the soldiers sort of complicate telling the story or looking into those divisions?
Yeah, I have a good friend, Sibel Fox, who's a sociologist at UC Berkeley, and she read of some very early drafts of some chapters years ago. And one of the things she kind of really pushed me to make sense of was, who when you talk about divides, who are the dividers? Who precisely is doing this dividing? So that was so helpful early on, because I really tried to be acutely aware of that, of that question. And so, yeah, I mean, and that's, if you read the introduction, I do try to tease it apart in the matter of a few paragraphs, right? But essentially argue that the civilian leaders of the military had lots to say on these issues, but depending on the context, line officers did as well. So especially, just to give you a quick example, like overseas, for example, kind of the day-to-day activities of units, the day-to-day racial policies of military units, when they were overseas, they often had a lot of autonomy. And so that kind of middle manager level of the military had much more say there than they did, say, in the US, when it came to say, who gets to join the military, what kinds of units are folks going to serve in. Those were big policy decisions that were being decided in Washington, D.C. But once folks moved, particularly out of the country, power and authority tended to devolve, and so you see other kinds of groups making those decisions. But I also constantly try to show the ways in which just ordinary service members are also constantly attempting to have their say, even though they don't have the same kinds of formal power. They still are constantly attempting to enter the picture and have their voices heard, whether that's in an effort to make the military more egalitarian or to make the military less egalitarian. So you see that kind of struggle playing out on the ground in lots of different ways.
Wow. Yeah. Did you find anything about the treatment of German Americans in the military?
You mean the U.S. military that had Dwight Eisenhower as the chief commander in the European theater of operations? Honestly, I don't remember seeing very much. I don't. One of my minor regrets is I don't. So I have this whole first book on Italian immigrants and race with regard to Europeans. I don't deal with that so much in this book, in part because it's just not. It's not much of a story. So there are a few Jewish soldiers do face, of all folks of European descent, Jewish soldiers absolutely face the most discrimination. I mentioned that a few times. There's a great book on that subject called GI Jews that came out about 15 years ago. But in terms of German Americans, no, I don't have much information that they faced much discrimination. And I think Eisenhower's um, prominent position in the army is just one example of how a lot changed from World War One to World War Two.
And the treatment of German POWs similarly, right? So there's always in civil
Yes,
rights
yes,
histories those little illustrations that are telling and heartbreaking, where
yes.
soldiers will go and look into a diner through the window, like black soldiers, the diner where they can't eat and German POWs are sitting at the counter, right? So the maintenance of those color lines and the acceptance of a sort of fraternity of certain unproblematic white people is like it's visible.
Yeah, that's such a great example of it. Exactly. That's another one of these stories that you hear Black soldiers or vets, recount over and over and over again. The immense humiliation that came from, right, seeing enemies of the U.S. government, enemies in World War II, being treated better than U.S. citizens in uniform. Um, and Japanese Americans also, right? Because they're constantly wondering, well, hold it now. The United States is not just fighting Japan; they're fighting Germany and Italy. And why are Germans and German Americans and Italian Americans not facing the same kinds of questions and surveillance and incarceration that we are?
Yeah, that's interesting. A question from Facebook. As you stated, race is a social construct. Many scholars have looked at the white-black binary during the Second World War in the U.S. military. In the future, would you consider focusing on Southern European/Jews as non-white within the context of the U.S. military during the Second World War?
Yeah, I mean, we just addressed that, a bit. And the point is, yeah, I mean, you're right. There's been a lot written on the black-white binary, and I attempt to contribute to that story. But as I mentioned early on, I'm also attempting to understand the other most salient racist divisions within the military. And while, again, Jews did face certain forms of discrimination, no doubt, it just was not. Southern and Eastern Europeans and Jews were not facing they were not salient racist divisions, were not disadvantaging them in any kind of systematic way. And therefore, they're part of the story, but they're part of the story as kind of a member of the military that's defined almost exclusively as white, and they get to reap many of the rewards that come with that. Although something that's kind of different between this book and my first one is, I very much want to understand the benefits that come from folks who are defined as white in the military, and that's a big part of the book, is understanding that and cataloging that, so we understand, kind of, again, the daily experiences of people's lives and the difference it made. Racism, the difference that various forms of racism made in their lives. But I also kind of end the book by pointing out that because anti-Black racism led to a systematic effort to restrict Black people's access to the military, that meant that more white people died. A disproportionately high number of white people died in the military. So this is just, and there are other examples of this, but this is just kind of, what is the book that came out about the pool politics? I'm blanking. Heather McGee's book, right?
The Sum of Us.
The Sum of Us, exactly. And she has got a great concept about drained pool politics, and that's in reference to a community, I think somewhere in the South, where they decided, rather than, if they were going to have an integrated pool, they would prefer to have no pool at all. So they just drained the pool, and no one got to swim during the summer.
Yeah.
So the ways in which racism is really, yes, it's advantaging some and disadvantaging other, but in some other ways it's disadvantaging everybody. And that story, a really, really important story, is something I tell as well.
Well, you have that point you make where you say there's African Americans are 10% of the population, 7% of the army or the military population, and
Right.
the difference is more than the number of soldiers who were at D-Day.
Yeah, if so the War Department promises in 1940 that Black soldiers will be there will be a proportional number of black soldiers in the Army. They don't actually promise that in the Navy and well, it's the War Department, so they're not talking about the Navy. But nonetheless, the Navy also makes some of these promises. And the kind of understanding, certainly by the middle part of the war years, is that all of the branches are going to make the best effort to kind of have a proportional representation of African Americans. And that never happens. So exactly, rather than 10% of the military, 10% of 16 million, which would be 1.6 million, you get 7%, about 1.2 million. Still an enormous number, right? I don't want to, I don't want to downplay the immense importance of African American service in the military, but nonetheless, had these racist restrictions not been in place, at least another 500,000 African Americans would have served, for better or worse. And that's another really complicated question. But nonetheless, yes, this is an example of the ways in which racism was shaping the military during this time.
Yeah. Tom, what was the most surprising thing that you came across in your research? Is it the tail story, or is there something else that's better or worse?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I guess maybe one of the downsides of taking 15 years to write a book is that you forget, what surprised you at some point.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess one thing that surprised me is just, how expansive racism was, how embedded, how entrenched in virtually every little aspect of military life in this period. I mean, that it doesn't, I don't care how many hours you spend in the archives, how many memoirs you read, how many oral histories you listen to, somehow that continued to surprise me. Just the scale, the sheer scale. And so, and therefore by implication, the immense investments that white America had in these distinctions, in some ways, never ceased to amaze me, and shock me and disturb me.
Yeah.
I guess I'll say on a more uplifting note, I'll say the other thing that's surprising was just also the scale of activism. I mean, that's really, really inspiring because, in the military was not a great place to be an activist. I mean, it's a very authoritarian structure. You could be executed, for being an activist, doing things that on the home front might have been totally, innocuous or seen as innocuous and not gotten into any major trouble. But in the military, it's a totally different deal. And yet, nonetheless, so many African American troops, Japanese American troops, Native American troops, a minority, but an important minority of white troops were deeply invested in a kind of a more egalitarian America, did take seriously some of the stated goals of the United States and its stated effort to kind of make the world a more democratic place and a more free place, and really fought for that, not just in their kind of formal military roles to some extent, but more importantly through their kind of activist efforts, which again took immense dedication and courage.
Yeah, for sure. My last question from the audience is, what has been the response to the book, and has there been any response from the military, sort of looking at their history and apologizing or sort of maybe being angry about it or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, so the book just came out on October 1st, and it takes people are busy. I get it. So there's always a little bit of a lag, I think. But nonetheless, I do have a talk planned at the U.S. Army Museum in a month or so, and then I also have a talk planned at the Army Navy Club in Washington D.C. So that was kind of interesting. I was happy to see the U.S. military now, in one form or another, attempting to grapple with this history. So I really, really look forward to those events, because it'll be it'll be a lot of fun to tell this story and to share this story and to discuss this story with folks who are in the military right now.
Yeah, definitely.
And I
Go ahead,
suspect,
Adriane.
I was just going to say, I suspect that the folks who have been in the military, like historically or sort of presently, will be the least surprised on some like the kind of myth of soldiering
Yeah.
and the kind of antiseptic, like super valorizing way that
Yes.
we talk about it now is in part a product, I think, of a move to an all volunteer force where people
Mm,
don't sort of like where it's not part of like quotidian life for many people.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mentioned I teach this World War II history and memory class, and it's the class is the best versions of this class have taken place when I have service members, veterans in the classroom, because yes, they are in my experience they've been very invested in de-romanticizing battle and war,
Mm.
and really to telling the real stories of what that is and what that's like and what it does to people.
Yeah. So we have just a couple minutes left. I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to sort of have some last thoughts. What would you like people to take away from this conversation or this subject? Any last
Um,
thoughts?
I'll go first because I feel like Tom should have the last thought. And so I'll just quickly say that one of the things that I mean, there's so many things that I like about this book. It really is a war and society book that takes those two parts very seriously and integrates them in a way that that is, you know, a model for for people to follow. Like it's fantastic. So you can learn a lot about World War II. You can learn a lot about racial formations. I think because of what I'm teaching this semester and planning for in subsequent semesters, one of the things that has also struck me is how it takes things that we say kind of quickly and without much thought about the post-war, that World War II produced the freedom struggles that follow, that, you know, the veterans of that were the stalwarts of this, that it helps us understand the like why you could have a desegregating order in 1948 and not really have an integrated military until the Vietnam War, right? Like it takes stuff that we say but don't really examine for the post-war period and kind of makes it um meatier and more legible and sort of more explicable. And so I'm grateful for the book for what it does in the period that it covers, but how it preps us to think about the decades to follow. So
Well, thanks. Thanks, Adrian. I guess I'll just end by saying, you know, this. So I started working on this book in a sense in 2005. I started reading secondary source material in 2005. I started writing in 2008. I had, you know, 2 kids, got married. A lot has happened in my life in that time. That's kind of slowed me down. But part of it was just the complexity, the sheer complexity of the story, the stories I was trying to tell. So anyway, all of that to say that it's unbelievably enjoyable and thrilling in a sense to just have the chance to share this, and to and especially amazing to do it with Adriane Lentz-Smith, whose work, she mentioned freedom struggles, was you know, the question was about what I read. That was absolutely one of the books I read as a model for how to tell broader U.S. history through military history. So thanks, Adriane. You've been kind of engaging in these conversations with me for a long time, and I'm really glad that we had a chance to do it again here.
oh man. Yeah.
Well, I hate to end this love fest between the two of you, but thank you both so much for the great conversation. It's been really enriching for all of us. And thank you to our audiences, both here on Crowdcast and on Facebook Live. And we'll see you next time. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye y'all.